the pre-Roswell thread. To understand how a mislabel became a mandate, we have to rewind farther back than Roswell, into the gray corridors of the Office of Strategic Services. In the 1940s, a memo crossed a desk with language that reads quaint and loaded at once. Atavistic motifs in blood antigen anomalies among candidates for a sensitive perception study. That was their term before remote viewing had a file drawer. The memo didn't claim superpowers. It flagged odd antigen reactions and asked for follow-up. Still, one handwritten margin note survives. Track kinship if feasible. By the mid-1950s, the language grew more clinical and more reckless. Project notes skirting MK-adjacent efforts mention a weak correlation between performance in controlled perception tests and rare mitochondrial signatures. Again, nothing definitive. Think T-scores nudging above noise. But the culture had shifted. The Cold War rewarded hunches dressed as hypotheses. A scientist cautioned that mitochondrial inheritance could create false clusters without environmental controls. The reply came back from operations: proceed with expanded screening. Here's where a taxonomy takes shape. In the late 1960s, as contractors began building out assay panels for unconventional selection programs, a few tissue samples produced cross-reactivity patterns that didn't map to standard human controls. The label NH, short for non-human, started as lab shorthand on worksheets to keep anomalous graphs grouped. It wasn't a conclusion. It was a sticky note. Then the sticky note got photocopied into briefings, and the briefings fed budgets. Three things happened in quick succession. 1. A crash retrieval file from the 1970s included burned tissue that hit the same cross-reactive nodes. 2. A private lab competing for renewals offered to stand up an offshore biobank for NH series motifs, pitching data safety and plausible deniability in the same breath. 3. An internal glossary, meant to unify acronyms, froze NH as non-human markers rather than non-harmonizing or non-homologous, the safer alternatives a few researchers proposed. Meanwhile, the psychology side kept shopping for patterns. Selection rosters for remote viewing cohorts show a higher-than-chance co-occurrence of these flagged motifs. Not proof, just enough to tempt a slide from curiosity to doctrine. Training logs note subtle performance elevation in microperturbation tasks among a subset the screeners could never quite define in plain English. One handler wrote, "We don't know what we're measuring, but we know when they have it." That line haunted later audits, but there was pushback. A 1973 internal critique labeled the genetic narrative superstition in a white coat, warning that uncontrolled background variables, nutrition, toxins, stress, could amplify or suppress signals that had nothing to do with ancestry. The critique recommended halting NH tagging until assay vendors validated with independent panels. The response: operational requirements override pause. The quiet deal with private labs moved the tagging pipeline offshore for continuity. While that was happening in New York boardrooms and Virginia basements, something else surfaced in the dirt. Archeogenetics teams, still fighting for funding and legitimacy, sequenced prehistoric bones from the Steppe and Anatolia. Their deep time reads turned up a conserved regulatory cluster that rhymed with the so-called NH-delta-7 motif. Not identical, rhymed. In Yamnaya and Andronovo horizons on the steppe, and across Anatolian Neolithic farming sites, the signal kept peeking through. Rare uniparental traces, C1A2 on the Y side, K2 in mitochondrial lines, sometimes traveled alongside it. This was the moment everything changed for the label. Instead of killing the non-human shorthand, the ancient echoes were treated as a paradox to be solved by policy. Rebrand NH as Non-Heritable, claim the cluster skip traditional lines, and keep screening under a new rationale. The glossary update preserved the old symbol and scrubbed the old meaning. The audit architecture absorbed the tweak without blinking. Inside one bunker-like training site, the handlers built an unofficial rule: never tell a recruit it runs in families. They'd seen what happened when someone learned their mother or grandfather's file carried the same code. Performance dropped. Attrition spiked. In one incident report, an asset walked off tasking after finding NH in a redacted casualty file tied to their surname. A supervisor wrote, "Do not discuss NH-related pedigree indicators." The machine needed compliance more than clarity. Early on, a few scientists tried to pivot the program toward resilience rather than psi, citing those same clusters appearing near neuromodulator and immune response loci. The pitch was simple: maybe this isn't about extraordinary perception, Maybe it's about who bends versus who breaks under certain pathogens or stress. The pitch almost worked. Then budgets hardened, and the screening continued under both banners, performance and resilience, depending on which meeting you were in. And here's the irony that keeps surfacing in the leak. The non-human origin wasn't aliens. It was a cascade, an assay artifact, a misread glossary, an operations culture that liked sharp labels, and a set of ancient sequences that made the story feel older and therefore truer. The pre-Roswell thread isn't about craft in the sky. It's about a bureaucracy that learned to speak in markers and forgot to ask what the words meant. By the time K sat for his first polygraph, that language had a half-century of momentum behind it. His denial wasn't a judgment of character. It was a downstream effect of a sticky note that became a category, and a category that became a filter on people's lives. What nobody knew at the time was how hard the rebrand would bite. Non-Heritable didn't mean kinship was irrelevant. It meant kinship would be downweighted just enough to justify looking everywhere. That shift let their questions burrow into polygraph scripts without tripping alarms. That shift kept the pipes humming while the label promised safety. The pre-Roswell thread ends with a sentence scrawled in a margin in the late 1970s. Operationalize under revised terminology. It reads like paperwork. It reads like fate when your life meets it at a badge reader. Bones, markers, and a mislabel. The first time the cluster had a shape, it came out of a cold room where breath fogged behind masks and bone dust rode the air. A small archaeogenetics team, chasing one more grant cycle, pushed deep-time reads on remains from the Eurasian Steppe and Anatolia. Their screens kept lighting on a conserved regulatory neighborhood that rhymed with NH-delta-7. Same coordinates near neuromodulator and immune response loci, same odd co-travelers. In Yamnaya and Andronovo horizons on the steppe, and across Anatolian Neolithic farming layers, the pattern surfaced like a watermark. It didn't announce aliens. It hinted at continuity. What jolted them wasn't just the neighborhood. Rare uniparental traces sometimes sat nearby. On the Y side, C1A2, thin today, practically a rumor. On the maternal side, K2 similarly scarce, an old thread that avoided scissors. The co-occurrence wasn't constant, but it showed up often enough to stop hand-waving. In the notes, you see care. Association observed, causality undetermined. Care didn't stop the machine that would read those notes later. Meanwhile, the mislabel already had a passport. In the late 1960s and 1970s, cross-reactivity on imperfect assay panels produced patterns that didn't map neatly to standard human controls. A bench tech wrote, NH, to keep the outliers grouped, non-harmonizing, non-homologous, take your pick. The sticky note traveled. A glossary froze it as non-human. That wasn't a revelation. It was an error that calcified the way office shorthand becomes a category when budgets need boxes. Corrections did arrive. Validation panels later showed the original anomaly bucket had artifacts mixed with signal. Scientists drafted memos to scrub non-human. From internal docs, swapping in non-harmonizing cluster, or the blander anomaly series. Leadership didn't argue the biology. They argued plumbing. Retain NH series for audit continuity, one directive said. Another, downstream systems depend on NH taxonomy. Refactor requires executive sign-off. Translation, the wiring mattered more than the words. Here's where the bones met the spreadsheets. A 2000s deep time project, independent of the older assay mess, flagged a near-identical regulatory constellation, mapping to the NH-delta-7 neighborhood. No non-human in sight, just tidy overlap, variants near neuromodulator pathways and immune signaling, with references back to Steppe and Anatolian datasets. One test said artifact, another said signal. The audit chose both, keep the label, keep the pipeline, and rebrand to Non-Heritable so the optics wouldn't burn. From their perspective, it made a cold kind of sense. If the label drew a clean circle around a messy phenomenon, it was useful. If ancient echoes gave that circle a lineage, it was defensible. And if corrections threatened schema connectors inside federated data lakes, it was dangerous. A senior analyst wrote, terminology change will disrupt scoring continuity across fiscal cohorts. Recommend semantic rescope, non-heritable. The acronym survived. So did the scoring. While those emails stacked up, Bones kept talking without knowing they were part of a pitch deck. A step burial with horse gear and a cut-marked long bone carried the regulatory motif. An Anatolian farmer with enamel worn by grain showed the same neighborhood. Lifeways didn't match. The motif did. That weakened the story that NH-delta-7 belonged to warriors, seers, or any single type. It strengthened the quieter story. The motif wasn't about what people did. It touched how bodies regulate stress and sickness. The audit's architecture ingested those footnotes like nutrients. Contractors defined NHC7, a derived feature built from SNPs near neuromodulators and immune response loci, an epigenetic age proxy if genotype was missing, and a kinship downweight factor to justify wide fishing. Ancient presence got a featherweight credit, modern assay presence got a lead weight, and polygenic pulls around immunity glued the middle. Red team reviewers warned the classification road ambiguity. NHC7 taxonomy ambiguity risks civil exposure, recommend paused. The sprint plan didn't blink. Now remember, non-heritable didn't mean families didn't matter. It meant kinship got downweighted enough to say, with a straight face, that surnames weren't predictive. Therefore you could look anywhere. The model docked points for adoption records, then clawed them back if proxies showed up elsewhere. It filtered out common surnames to avoid false clusters, then reattached identities with linkage attacks when mission flags required names. Non-heritable wasn't a truth claim. It was a permission structure. The stakes landed in inboxes and waiting rooms. A donor registry flagged compatibility constraints a physician had never seen in clinical policy. A campus-gifted referral included an optional stress profile screen that mapped one-to-one to an audit feature vector. A job applicant who'd never mailed a cheek swab faced interview questions keyed to maternal indices and step origin ancestry, language lifted from a lineage module buried inside the audit's training deck. And the irony never left the room. The original non-human stamp wasn't evidence of a species line. It was bureaucratic entropy, an assay shortcut turned into a doctrine, then rescued by ancient data that rhymed with the modern signal, just enough to feel inevitable. The Archeogenetics papers, careful to say functional significance undetermined, got boiled down to bullet points that dropped the caution and kept the coordinates. We kept reading the leak like a ledger. Schema files defining NHC7, migration scripts mapping legacy NH-delta-7 flags, comments demanding monotonicity across cohorts, and a glossary that evolved from non-human to non-heritable while preserving the same hunting ground. Every artifact said the quiet part: fix the label, keep the pipes, and route the people who match. So when K looked up from his denial and asked why his life had bent sideways, the answer lived in a cold room and a sticky note. Bones that whispered continuity. A shorthand that hardened into a filter. A rebrand that let the machine scale without changing what it wanted. Not aliens. Not magic. A tilt small, persistent, near the levers that decide who gets called, who gets watched, and who gets told the story last. The audit machine. While Bones hinted at continuity, the machine learned how to turn hints into policy. Between 2014 and 2026, contracts stitched together worlds that pretended they were separate. Ancestry kits hawked on holidays, newborn screening panels folded into hospital workflows, and military MEPS intake labs standardizing occupational health. Each looked harmless alone. Together, they formed a nervous system. On paper, the architecture sounded cautious. No single vault, federated data lakes. No plain IDs, hashed salted tokens. No free-for-all, role-based access controls and audit logs that logged the logging. But the procurement language gave away the ambition. Phrases like harmonized schemas, interoperable tokenization, and cross-context query capability slid through line items. Translation: keep the ponds separate, connect them with pipes no one outside a badge can see. Inside those pipes lived a scoring model the leak named outright. It pulled from the rebranded taxonomy, NHC7, and pushed two outputs: recruitment triage and watchlist emergence. High resilience index. Expect a call that jumps waitlists. A recruiter who knows your grandmother's birthplace before you tell them. High volatility index. Expect nothing you can screenshot. Just a cooler interview tone, a badge that lags, a patrol car that lingers. Here is how the lookup flowed, step by step. First, a hashed email or kit ID from a consumer genomics portal aligned with a salted token generated at a hospital lab. Next, a newborn screening record, wrapped in compliance, contributed a biochemical near-field correlate, the model treated like a handrail when genotypes were missing. Then, MEPS intake added a contemporaneous anchor under occupational health. None of these steps looked like each other. Each passed legal review standing alone. In sequence, they formed a spine. Email headers in the archive drew a thin red line to 2026. Completion milestone kept popping up next to citations of a regulatory sunset, a data-sharing loophole closing at year's end. Council notes read, achieve federation prior to revocation of permissive disclosures. That is why the finish line was fixed. It was legislative weather. Close the network before the law changes the sky. Meanwhile, real lives felt the spray. A high school senior with a scholarship offer received a cheerful verification discrepancy email, then silence. A marrow donor, a perfect match, was reclassified, ineligible for donation due to compatibility tiering, language her physician had never seen in a policy manual. A mid-career engineer watched his green access nudge amber for a day, then back to green, and started taking the stairs because elevator badge readers stalled. K stepped into this machine the blunt way. His polygraph, the one that asked about step ancestry and mitochondrial lineage, wasn't a rogue examiner. It mirrored a training deck in the leak titled Non-Heritable Cluster Standardization. The lineage prompts were copy-pasted across agencies and, later, across borders. The model wasn't just scoring DNA. It was scripting people. What nobody outside the contracting rooms saw was how tightly the plumbing hugged privacy law. Hashing and tokenization met the letter of anonymization. Linkage attacks did the rest. A red team memo warned, re-identification feasible with 2 external attributes. The response, risk acceptable under current statutory interpretation. In other words, if no one sues before 2026, it ships. Now remember, none of this needed the sensational non-human framing. The rebrand to Non-Heritable Cluster 7 bought cover. It let them argue the cluster didn't track cleanly by surname, accurate in a country of adoptions, blended households, and opaque paternity. But the code told on itself. Kinship was downweighted, not zeroed. Surname frequency acted as a noise filter. Known adoptees lost points, then gained them back if proxies surfaced. Non-Heritable functioned as a marketing claim that allowed a wide net. While the dark plumbing matured, the bright face smiled. Outreach pilots framed as resilience talent identification hit campuses and community centers. A booth with a heartbeat logo offered no-cost stress profile screens. The consent form buried a clause permitting secondary analysis for readiness research. Opt-out existed in theory. In practice, the toggle reset, and a staffer hovered with a clipboard. We traced governance through calendar invites and travel vouchers. A contractor offsite in Reston demoed schema harmonization, with Ancestry brands on one slide, hospital EHR vendors on another. A hotel roundtable near a major base titled Occupational Health Futures featured a talk on environmental pathogen resilience. No one said NHC7 at a podium. At coffee, a lanyard flashed the glossary behind a badge. Across town, a nonprofit hosted a panel on genetic discrimination. Attendees nodded through GINA's limits. Life, disability, and long-term care insurance sit outside its shield. Offstage, an insurer analyst chatted about behavioral epigenetics and DNA image acceleration like weather maps. 2 weeks later, a pilot proposal landed in the same inboxes that managed the audit, offering to normalize resilience indices across risk products. The machine had a buyer. Here's the kicker: the leak repeats. A red team report wrote, NHC7 taxonomy ambiguity risk civil exposure, recommend pause for clarity. The sign-off line stamped, noted, proceed under revised nomenclature. They didn't fix the signal, they fixed the label, and they built the rest of the year around finishing the pipes before anyone could shut the valve. Kay read those same memos and understood why his life felt 1 degree off. Not haunted, calibrated, by an audit that treated lineage like a feature flag, wrapped it in a word that sounded safe, and taught examiners to ask questions that never quite said what they meant. Psi cohorts and the bunker files. While the audit learned to score, an older chase kept humming in rooms without clocks. Psi cohorts who trained in bunkers and left with headaches and non-disclosure agreements. Their rosters, the leak shows, were quietly cross-tabbed against NHC7 carriers at higher-than-chance rates. No comic book powers, just a subset that leans slightly better on certain days, enough for operations to keep feeding the pipeline. Selection felt procedural and strange. Recruits sat at green pads under humming vents, sketching targets sealed in other rooms, nudging random event generators with stare-and-breathe drills, narrating impressions while monitors marked timestamps. Success lived in small deltas, Sketches landing inside silhouettes, Z-scores edging above expectation. In the logs, a handful of IDs ticked more boxes more often. No one told them why those boxes mattered. Handlers called those days bump days. Notes read, Subject S, 14 exhibits persistent micro-PK elevation. Recommend extended protocol. When we overlaid anonymized IDs with NHC7 positives from the audit schema, the match rate cleared chance by an inch, not a mile. Red team statisticians flagged expectancy effects, handlers logging wins with more enthusiasm than misses. But in blinded repeats run off-site, NHC7 carriers still leaned higher than peers by that same stubborn inch. The rule that shaped everything arrived the hard way: never talk about bloodlines. A former handler, steady voice, careful verbs, told us the moment they learned it. A trainee found a redacted casualty printout left on a shared printer. A surname matched her grandmother's. Beside it, the old NH shorthand. She refused tasking the next morning. In the incident report, a supervisor wrote, "Asset unresponsive following exposure to NH pedigree indicator. Recommend rotation." Performance dipped whenever lineage entered the room. Attrition spiked when someone connected the dots. The bunker files keep a ledger of those human cracks. A quiet top performer was told against policy that his maternal line aligned with resilience cohorts. He lasted 3 more weeks. Another subject aced a perception week, then saw the word step in a stray slide at a debrief, and spent the next session staring at paper until the clock ran out. A psych note put it gently: identity interference correlates with disclosure of pedigree status. Translation: tell them it runs in families, and the story eats the skill. Meanwhile, the doctrine staggered between 2 motives: cultivate perception or recruit ballast. People who bend but don't break when settings go gray and weird. Budget lines toggled quarterly. Operational outputs, 1 slide. Resilience sourcing, the next. The same chairs, the same drills, 2 stories depending on who needed the headcount. Here's the part that shoved the narrative off the table. A pathogen scare rolled through a mountain training cycle. Fevers, fog, the kind of illness that usually knocks people flat for a week. Several NHC7 positives rebounded in 3 days. Bloodwork sketched atypical inflammatory curves. A clinic note read, "Atypical neuroimmune modulation observed. Recommend longitudinal monitoring." So I didn't explain that. Resilience did. And the audit's cluster, seated near neuromodulator and immune response loci, suddenly had a purpose operations could say aloud in the right rooms. From there, the training decks shifted tone without losing modules. Less talk of signal acquisition, more of operational hardiness under contest conditions. The same perception drills stayed in, because myths recruit. A campus flyer promised cognitive perception research that looked like psychology and felt like a screen. Inside, the lineage module the audit standardized taught examiners how to ask about maternal indices and step origin echoes, without ever saying family. Unbeknownst to the trainees, polygraph banks absorbed those prompts years before the rebrand. The question that cut chaos first session, "Have you concealed step ancestry?" wasn't an outlier. It matched a lineage slide titled Non-Heritable Cluster Standardization, later mirrored in allied decks. The rebrand had sanded the label. It hadn't touched the levers. The files also document ceilings the myth refuses to admit. Effect sizes on micro-PK and target description hover near statistical comfort. Replications fail as often as they nudge forward. Handlers record headaches, sleep disruption, windows closing in the mind after week 6. Psych notes ride the fence. Elevated stress responsivity in subset correlating with NHC7 classification, causality unresolved. A colder memo follows. Attrition acceptable, maintain cadence. People cycle out. The model asks for more. A micro-story lands like a pin dropping. A recruit in a windowless room, palms damp on green paper, sketches a bridge. The sealed target is a cup. He laughs, then stares. The monitor gives a neutral thank you. 2 sessions. Later, a recovery drill swaps in breath pacing, visual noise, heart rate variability on screen. He nails the downshift in 5 minutes. The note reads, rapid return to baseline, schedule for extended hardening. The bridge sketch won't make a slide. The bounce back will. Meanwhile, crosstabs tightened around myth-adjacent temptation. A cluster analysis flagged slightly elevated consistency on perception tasks among NHC7 positives. Operations read tilt as destiny. Red team reviewers underlined confounds, expectancy, handler bias, uneven environments. The reply came stamped, acknowledged, proceed, resilience priority. Psi kept its seat because it filled chairs. Resilience drove the bus because it filled mission briefs. K found his file years after the denial and underlined the sentence that binds these rooms to the audit. Assets with confirmed NHC 7 classification demonstrate marginal performance elevation and increased resilience potential. Disclosure correlates with attrition. The program had measured its own fear. Tell people the truth and they walk. Don't tell them, and they'll sit for the next drill that looks like science and feels like selection. The bunker files don't sell wonder. They sell process. How a sticky note from the late 1960s became a screening doctrine. How an ancient regulatory echo gave a modern pipeline a pedigree. How a pathogen curve turned psi lore into wellness language. How lineage questions slipped into polygraphs under a non-heritable banner. And how a handful of human inches, steadier hands after a fever, a sketch that leans closer to a shape, were enough for a bureaucracy to build a machine that still hums when the room is dark and the pencils are. Line just right,